Welcome back to Paris Lesbos. One of us is a pixie, the other gets called Rena. And today is a request because this woman wrote the woe is me pity party that everyone else calls the well of loneliness. You can tell already that I have mixed feelings. But before we get to the book that spawned an obscenity trial that Virginia Woolf got involved in, we start at the beginning.
I'm intrigued already. Who could have possibly written The Well of Loneliness? Who is our protagonist for the time?
Radclyffe Hall was born Marguerite Radclyffe Hall on August 12, 1880, to an upper-class British family. You can probably already tell that she never went by that name, and we're off to a great start with a father gallivanting off somewhere and a mother she hated. It was not a good marriage between her parents either. This was probably not helped by their first daughter, Florence, dying at the age of 1 a few weeks before our protagonist's birth. A few weeks after Hall's own birth, her father left.
I mean, honestly, given the quality of fathers for a lot of these women, that might be for the best.
Well, I also feel the need to interject here that to me, this is similar to Romaine Brooks. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if you told me Hall was conceived as a last-ditch effort to save her parents' marriage, the same way Romaine was. That said, people, don't go expecting kids to save your marriage. A baby ain't a foundation or an anchor. You're still getting divorced.
Yeah, no, a kid cannot stand in for couples counseling, even though I guess that hadn't been invented yet.
To add to Hall's misfortunes, she was dyslexic and living in a time that really didn't do well with dyslexics. Like, it is literally only in the late 1800s that anyone becomes aware of dyslexia, really, and naming it, and starts trying to study it.
Oh, wow.
Also, speaking from experience, all these old people's cursive handwriting is on par with chicken scratch. I wouldn't be surprised if you told me her own cursive was a mess to try and hide misspellings, as I've seen that in my own family. There is also the fact that Radclyffe Hall was a sickly baby. She got pneumonia twice, and then scarlet fever, which led to teenage asthma and bronchitis, before settling into a lifetime of hypochondria.
I mean, she's in such poor health to begin with. I'd say hypochondria might be a good defensive measure. At the very least, it makes sense.
There is also talk that her mother, Marie, beat her.
Ooh,
Her mother's dislike of Hall also just increased during the divorce proceedings in 1882. Hall was given over to her mother's custody during that, and her father refused to pay the £2,000 the court mandated. He wanted to give £200 for Hall and £200 for the maid's baby, who may have been one of his illegitimate children. Her mother would later claim that the adult Hall owed her the £2,000. Eventually, lawyers persuaded her father to set up a £10,000 trust for Hall, which funded the house her mother lived in with her. That said, he didn't make the 3-month interval visits.
wow, so both great parents.
And then Hall's mother married her Italian music teacher in either 1889 or 1890 in Belgium. When they returned to London, things did not improve. He tutored attractive girls who sometimes boarded with the family, and he flirted with them. That later included making unwanted advances to a teenage Radclyffe Hall, which might have also been fueled by the belief that heterosexual advances would cure any burgeoning homosexuality.
Great guy. So yeah, her burgeoning homosexuality. Do we know anything about that?
So at 17, it's known that Hall had her first crushes on her stepfather's female students. Agnes Nichols was already 20 and a soprano who had won competitions, even, but she had started out being tutored by Hall's stepfather. So it's not surprising that the first thing Hall fell in love with or even noticed was Agnes's voice. It was not exactly an equal relationship. so much as a worship the ground Agnes walked on scenario.
That makes sense. That this older uh, woman, I guess, uh, who is talented and is seems to be going on to a great career, kind of is overshadowing Hall at this moment in her life.
Yeah, that does make sense. That said, it did bring Hall out of herself. She went out riding horses, drove a car, took up drinking, yet didn't become an alcoholic. Like any teen discovering the joy of being away from one's parents' eyes. It is uncertain if Agnes realized Hall was in love with her because A, nothing sexual happened, and B, Agnes married a composer a few years later. So they ended up distant friends after that.
This happened so long ago, but this is such a classic story of having an ambiguous female friendship when one is growing up. Just like, yeah, really intense, nothing explicitly sexual, but like, this is clearly something is going on.
Meanwhile, the arguments between Hall's mother and stepfather eventually devolved into domestic violence. Friendless and with an elderly grandmother unable to protect her, Hall hid in the garden and scribbled stories. Even her education was not great. Like most upper-class children, Hall had a series of governesses. It does not sound like her mother cared to vet them well, so her education wasn't well-rounded. In her teens, Radclyffe Hall was sent to day schools. This was followed by a brief stint at King's College in London, and then a year in Dresden, Germany, to study literature. So not out of the norm for an upper-class woman at the time. Though the dyslexia did not help. She could recall coming home from her first day of actual school and the teacher having been surprised that it seemed like Hall could not read because she kept messing things up.
Yeah, no, I've heard of that being an issue before dyslexia was like widely understood, that it's just why are these upper class children not automatically good at this skill? It sounds like even for all of the money that she grew up with, she really did not have the most advantages.
No, I know everyone likes to both bring up and clown on the saying money can't buy happiness. Money can technically buy you advantages, but only if you actually use it to do that, or if it's used well, or your parents care to, as we can see.
Right. Yeah, no, if your rich parents care about you at all, then maybe they'll take the extra time to make sure you're doing well.
Unfortunately for an 18-year-old Hall, her father died in 1898 and left her with mild tuberculosis and no inheritance, as that went to her cousins because he couldn't change his will before dying.
Love it. Even in death, he's disappointing her.
And yet, she appears to have idolized him, probably because he was so absent from her life that she could just project things onto him. Instead, Radclyffe Hall got an inheritance from her grandfather at the age of 21 in 1901. The arguments with her mother and stepfather skyrocketed after that. When Hall's solicitor then revealed that her mother had overspent her allowance by £12,000, her mother's response was just another verbal explosion. To those confused, £12,000 in 1901 is approximately £1.8 million today, or $2.3 million. I'm not even sure what this woman could have bought, as I don't think the house was a mansion.
She just misplaced it. No, that's so wild then. Going back to that thing you were saying earlier about her mother saying that Hall owed her £2,000. Like, no, I don't think so anymore.
As a result, Radclyffe Hall moved out and rented a house in Kensington with her grandmother. Like any suddenly emancipated, independently wealthy young person, she ran wild, specifically with cigarettes and horses.
I love this. This is such a cool move.
Unlike the alcohol, she never gave up smoking. Meanwhile, the horses took her to hunting parties from 1901 to 1907. Hall also started a relationship with her widowed cousin Jane Randolph when Hall visited the US. There were road trips and drinking champagne all night before sneaking home past older, prim relatives. This only lasted about 2 years as Jane married a wealthy Texan. Then there was Hall's first cousin Dorothy for a while.
So what? She's just dating cousins? That feels a bit weird.
There's a fair amount of weirdness because later on we also have leaving your now deceased practically wife for her cousin who you had an affair with during the last year.
Right. I'll look forward to it.
But Dolly here was then replaced in 1906 with Violet Hunt, the one time fiancée of Oscar Wilde, who then went on a scandalous bender when Wilde decided he didn't want to marry her.
Right. So finally someone outside of the family.
Violet was similar to Hall and had also published 7 dramas by that time. She isn't really remembered for it today. She's known for being scandalous, contracting an STD, and then getting involved with some better known male poet or writer.
Hmm.
Radclyffe Hall, by this point, had published a book of poetry, but the 26-year-old hadn't found her footing yet. So basically, Hall is out having a very good time and not having to worry about money or constantly deal with her mother's outbursts or husband.
So no, so that sounds like a good escape that she's kind of getting to live on her own and experience life.
Yes, this lifestyle changes a bit when Radclyffe Hall sees Mabel Batten in a hotel dining room in Edinburgh in September 1906. They did not properly meet then. That occurred later the next August at a spa in Hamburg, Germany. At 51 and having lived in India, which was known to the English as a source of tropical ailments, Batten was not out of place. At 27 and in full health, Radclyffe Hall was. According to the biographer Sally Klein, Hall was basically just trying to get a meeting with Batten. Now you're probably wondering what exactly changes here compared to the previous 3 women. Well, Batten basically gets a philandering layabout heiress to put pen to paper and actually do something with her life. You remember how I said the focus on hunting ended in 1907, right? It's partially because of this, though not before being thrown from her horse, getting a concussion, and nearly breaking her neck.
Wow. But it sounds like Batten is really like a driving force in giving Hall direction.
Yes, this starts a time where Batten says, "You should do this," and Hall does it. It's a bit like that meme of, if a beautiful woman disagrees with me, I will immediately change my views. I have no principles. Batten says learn French, so Hall learns French. Try Spanish culture. Radclyffe Hall takes her holidays among the locals in Spain and learns a smidge of Spanish. Go to an art gallery. Read more. See this play. You see where this is going.
Mm-hmm.
Batten basically pushed her to know more and do more.
And if she says jump, Hall says how high.
By the way, amidst all this, Hall meets Tupi Lowther, who we have an episode on and who is a model for a character in The Well of Loneliness. I'd also like to add that I did not realize Hall also read and became a fan of Renee Vivian's poetry. If you're confused, there is an episode explaining who Vivian was too, and you should also read her poetry.
That's really cool. There's kind of some crossover stuff happening in this time in her life.
Now, Mabel Batten is the one to give Radclyffe Hall the nickname John, sometimes turned into Johnny. And no, before anyone asks, this has nothing to do with Hall being transgender in the modern sense.
Right, because, you know, she was expressing some gender variance, but this is more just a different system of gender and sexuality back then. So you can't really map their expression then to what that would mean in today's terms.
Or we can borrow the words of Sally Klein. In the 1920s, when a heterogendral pattern for relationships seemed the only conceivable model for homosexuals, John and Una both saw themselves as women, one more masculine than the other, who used a butch femme relationship as a way to configure their lives. Though some men, like Mabel Batten's husband, may have been more comfortable thinking of Hall as a younger man gallivanting about with their wife.
I mean, yeah, if you can't imagine your wife cheating on you with another woman, then I guess that could help.
For further talk about that, there's also in 1925, there's the words from Rupert Hart Davis, who talks about going to dinner parties and would say, "It was always said at a dinner party, when the women left the table, Johnny Hall found it hard to make up her mind whether to go with the women or remain with the men."
Yeah, I can believe that because the like heterosexual woman role is different from the lesbian woman role,
Speaking of George Batten,
as we were so long ago.
he died the same year as Hall's grandmother before World War I. After that, Mabel Batten and Radclyffe Hall lived together. Also, her horse died, so there was a definitive end to hunting. By this point, Hall also had started to wonder about whether she should stick to poetry.
How had the poetry been going? Was she publishing a lot of it?
So her first 5 published volumes were poems, but in 1911, she had her doubts about continuing after the publication of the third. Meanwhile, she also got involved with the suffragettes, though it was more meetings and letter writing than marching in the streets or the violence of some other measures.
So she's not chaining herself to anything.
No, nor is she getting trampled by a horse at races. And so we come to World War One. Radclyffe Hall was not amused, because Mabel Batten didn't want her going off and joining in like Tupi Lowther or Mary Sophia Allen. So Hall was stuck learning first aid in England and then taking wounded soldiers from a hospital to a library and back again. Meanwhile, several of our other women whom she knew went overseas with ambulances.
That sounds like she probably felt like she was really missing out on all the action.
Yes, but to add some context, Batten was ill. She also suffered broken bones and a vertebrae injury during a car accident. In fact, she would die in 1916.
Okay, so yeah, she wants Hall to stay there and take care of her. That makes sense.
That said, interesting enough, Radclyffe Hall was very eager, and by very eager, I mean this is the type of woman who bemoaned not being a man because she wanted to enlist.
Yeah, all right. So this sounds like a fracture in their relationship.
By that point, Hall had known Mabel's cousin, Una Trubridge, for a year or two. The affair was supposed to be a fling like one other previous infidelity.
Oh boy, Hall, come on.
She miscalculated. Mabel Batten was aware, it seems. There were quarrels between her and Radclyffe Hall. One ended in Batten getting up from the table, having a seizure, and then slipping into a coma. Hall didn't leave her side until Batten died 10 days later, after never waking up again.
Wow. What a way to go.
I know everyone always says it's terrible to leave on an argument, but at the same time, Batten was basically her wife and severely ill, and Hall had taken up with her cousin. I find it a bit fitting then that Hall had to think over what if conversations as a result.
Yes. That's just a sucky situation, though.
After Batten's death, Radclyffe Hall spiraled a bit. She put fresh flowers around Batten's photo, asked the Vatican to say masses for her. She practically created a shrine at one point. She also didn't care if this made Una uncomfortable.
Oh, wait, they're still together?
Yes and no.
Hmm.
Una is refusing to leave, and Hall keeps trying to push her away with a metaphorical pole arm.
Oh boy.
But she does a terrible job of that. There was also drama over funeral arrangements that led to tensions over joint execution of the will between Radclyffe Hall and Mabel Batten's daughter. By 1919, Hall and Batten's family were no longer speaking to each other.
Sounds familiar. I feel like we've seen this happen before in a couple of episodes.
Now, at some point in 1917, Una and Hall mostly reconcile because Hall is terrible at not giving in to temptation.
Wonderful.
By 1919, that reconciliation was solid, though Radclyffe Hall was ambivalent about Una's 9-year-old daughter. Hall was sort of hot and cold when it came to the kid.
I mean, given her upbringing, I can see where that stems from.
So, to illustrate, there would be walks, presents, playing games, paying for school, even talk of university if the child showed the brain for it. And then there would be indifference or even resentment from Hall towards her. For example, there was a time Una's daughter was severely ill with first the flu and then chickenpox. She had to go to the hospital. As a result, Una's whole focus was on her daughter.
Understandably, it's her daughter.
Hall then suddenly got a bad headache and earache. Not even her biographers are sure as to how genuine Hall's ailments were here versus how much they were about recapturing Una's attention.
Sounds pretty childish of her.
Interestingly, biographer Sally Klein talks about an incident at an Italian orphanage where Hall almost adopted a baby and various scenarios from Hall's fiction about a lack of children in lesbian relationships, though the orphanage incident could also just be protectiveness born from childhood trauma.
I mean, yeah, she had a very difficult upbringing, so I can see a lot of this fluctuation around parenthood being the result of that.
With World War I behind us, Hall cut her hair in 1920. It had been long before that.
What does that mean? Oh, her hair had been long. Her hair had been long. I was like, wait, she cut her hair before 1920? But then, what do you mean?
Yes, it had been conventional, long, could have pinned it up in elaborate hairdos.
That's so great that they were like calling her John and she was like, you know, smoking cigars with the men while her hair was fully long. I feel like that, I don't know. We have different ideas around hair length.
Well, it's also that now you get the image that you probably have always pictured her in and that you've seen in photos: the short hair, the iron shirt, the bow tie, the men's jacket.
Yeah, no, she is finally becoming the version of herself that we all knew she would be.
She also set out seriously on fiction. That said, she still could not spell. According to her secretary Winifred Hales, Hall preferred hearing her work read out to her. In fact, she would be so embarrassed over her spelling that she would hide manuscripts and contemplate destroying them. If you think this is extreme, well, she had difficulty even reading her own handwriting at times, which from my experience isn't as uncommon as you'd think if she was writing in cursive rather than in print.
That sounds like it was a real challenge.
From where I'm sitting, yes, but you especially know this, Pixie, because you hear all my complaints about trying to read archived letters from this time. There would be 5 books published during the 1920s by Radclyffe Hall, with the last being the most famous and troublesome. Initially, the first one, The Unlit Lamp, involved a severe case of not quite writer's block. By the sounds of it, Hall despaired at one point of actually being able to write prose. She did manage to finish it after a few years, and it was published in 1924. It is not as explicit as the more famous book, but it does have a lesbian relationship in it. If you do want to read it, the biographer Sally Klein at least considers it to be the easiest of Hall's novels for a modern reader.
And I bet you could find it online.
Certainly somewhere. Even if you can't find it for free at like a library or something, you can probably find it on Amazon or a used copy being sold somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it would be another 4 years before the Well of Loneliness arrived. But first, an interlude of my favorite painter. Hall and Una Troubridge meet Romaine Brooks at a party, and she invites them to her villa on Capri.
Imagine being at that party. Just imagine.
I think Romaine would be sick of me very quickly.
Well, probably of any of us, but maybe also of Hall and Una, to be honest.
Now, they never end up going to Capri with Romaine, but Hall and Romaine still end up friends, for a time at least.
Oh, that's ominous.
Through Romaine, Hall meets Natalie Barney, who you may recognize in the character of Valerie Seymour. It's during this time period that Romaine ends up painting a portrait of Una, which Una didn't particularly care for. The friendship was strained after that.
Oh boy, so that there it is. That's what it is.
I mean, we're talking about the painter who's an heiress and who's just like, I will paint as I see fit and who I wish.
Right, no, and she's not out there trying to flatter people.
Definitely not. Now, by the time we get to 1928, Radclyffe Hall is 48 and has won 2 literary prizes for her previous book, Adam's Breed. That said, there were events that got her wondering about things. One friend was ill and stuck at home while her partner still met up for lunch with Hall. At the time, unless you lied, nurses wouldn't let you stay long if your girlfriend, or basically wife, had to be in the hospital, especially unconscious. Like most people, events that happened to her friends got Hall thinking about what she would do in such a scenario. Part of that ended up in The Well of Loneliness because Hall started to wonder if she could use a book to raise talk of such issues. That said, she also chose to focus on miserable bars rather than gatherings like Natalie's in a bid for sympathy, despite Natalie appearing as a character and a bright spot in the narrative.
I wonder how much of that is kind of following the censorship conventions at the time, because they did often allow people to write about homosexuality as long as it was tragic and never seen in a positive light.
While that is a thought, I don't get the feeling that was the main focus. I think it was, how do we make people feel sympathetic for someone? It's by making them appear in the most misery-inducing scenarios possible.
You can't let the straights know we have fun.
Can't let them know how many rich lesbians there are over here.
Yeah, right. Can't let them know about Community. That's just really sad.
I will say, I did not expect Renee Vivian to be an influence on this book with the idea of being an outcast, but according to biographer Sally Klein, she was at least with her life story, if not her own work. To recap, Renee Vivian had a tragic end. She got addicted to alcohol, ended up anorexic, never got over the death of her situationship before Natalie, and then converted to Catholicism on her deathbed in her 30s after a very successful poetry career. That is the TLDR. If you want the rest, one of our first episodes was on her, including the time Natalie got a friend to sing under her window in order to throw a bouquet with a letter up to her during their on-again, off-again relationship.
This was before they had boom boxes.
Yeah, before boomboxes, you had to go borrow an opera singer. And now we come to the famous bit. The Well of Loneliness is published. It flies off the shelves. Some, like Vera Brittain, praise it as an inoffensive plea for compassion. Others condemn it as the most shocking poison that curious children and the nation must be protected from at all costs, even though it's not a book for kids, but it goes with the idea that homosexuality is actually something that can spread, instead of just existing like hair color does. So Radclyffe Hall got her wish for noise, but she also got her fear that she'd actually have to be outspoken now. Which brings us to the
Mm-hmm.
trial.
Yeah, that's right, because she's not a suffragette chaining herself to things. She hasn't been really out there on the front lines before this.
Yes, and also she strikes me as an introvert. The way biographers have talked of her being introduced to Mabel Batten's circle of friends and just gang out more sounds like the incredibly shy introvert who has not had to deal with people for most of her life suddenly having to figure out how do I talk to people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And now this is talking to people with much higher stakes.
So much like with 50 Shades of Grey, any shock and outcry just made the book that much more popular. But in this case, Hall was also dragged in front of a court for obscenity. At one point, the book is withdrawn from publication, prompting the likes of Virginia Woolf to get involved with the trial, even though she thought it was not a great book.
I mean, it sounds like it was kind of targeting a straight audience and maybe not a pure artistic expression as much as it was a bit of gay propaganda, but we got to have that gay propaganda out there.
The only thing I can think of in relation to that is modern politics having a hissy fit, tizzy fit, whatever you want to call it, over gay propaganda.
Oh, I know. But you know what I'm trying to say here, that she was trying to write the most inoffensive, polite little thing, and even that was just too much.
I mean, from what I know of the book, because I haven't read the whole thing myself, I've only seen snippets here and there. So it's like several scenes at a time. The reason I call it the Woe Is Me Pity Party is because it feels like a book that apologizes for even breathing. Like, I would not be surprised if the
Mm.
protagonist apologized for existing. So while it is like inoffensive, it is offensive in its inoffensiveness for the amount of misery that's in it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this case does not end in Hall's favor. The appeals court then upheld the order. The book was found obscene and therefore not to be allowed in the UK. Naturally, Radclyffe Hall was bitter and left to pay the legal costs. There was also an obscenity trial in the US. The outcome for that was that the book was not obscene, and it became an underground bestseller with printings done in France.
Oh, I can believe that. I mean, there's nothing so delicious as a novel that has been banned, or almost banned in this case.
What is amusing from this time is that Radclyffe Hall was also out saying lesbians should be allowed to be legally married. Meanwhile, she felt trapped in her own practically married life with Una.
Oh boy, yeah, she doesn't seem like marriage material. Not Una, I mean Radcliffe Hall.
I mean, what do we think of a woman who basically stole her cousin's wife?
Yeah, not great. I don't know. Maybe they're meant for each other.
Meanwhile, the book and the trial destroyed some friendships, like that with Tupi Lowther, which it's not helped by Una's gossiping about whatever Tupi was doing or feeling.
That's right, because Tupi is like kind of a major inspiration for this book that also is like a lot more transparent than you would want it to be if you were a lesbian at this time.
Well, also, it sounds like Radclyffe Hall never really sat down with Tupi Lowther and had a conversation after this. She was instead being relayed information through Una.
Love it. Absolutely love it. This sounds like it cannot end poorly at all.
Radclyffe Hall doesn't stop writing, though. She'd write another 3 published novels before her death.
None of those ones got her in court, though.
But that does not mean that the drama ended. Radclyffe Hall got swept into the drama of the writer Vita Sackville West's love life because Hall had once been friends with journalist Evelyn Irons, who was in a bit of a pickle. Evelyn and her girlfriend Olive Rinder and a Christopher St. John, who appears to have been a woman, were all in love with and had been involved with Vita, who is married to diplomat Harold Nicholson, by the way, to give you a clearer picture.
What is going on here?
Well, Evelyn needed Hall to essentially stage an intervention as they were all rejected at various stages by Vita, and Chris at least became suicidal at one point. It also ended the relationships Evelyn and Chris were in at the time. Vita, Vita, Vita. Where would our podcast be without your antics, dear?
Seriously, I mean, this is full soap opera.
Speaking of drama, the 1930s saw Radclyffe Hall get into her own. Una fell ill at one point and needed a nurse. Hall got one from the American hospital. Evgenia Sulin was a refugee white Russian who spoke a little English. Radclyffe Hall started an affair with her as she saw Sulin as beautiful, innocent, and rather lost.
And I mean, isn't this classic Radclyffe Hall behavior? Like, I don't know why Una expected anything different when she did the same thing last time one of her long-term partners got ill.
Una tried at first to get rid of this when she recovered. That didn't last, but she did allow a correspondence between the two. As that continued,
Oh boy.
Una started getting a series of ailments, perhaps due to her public protestations that nothing was wrong. Confining the affair to letters didn't last, but Una didn't leave. She tolerated the whole thing very painfully.
Okay, so this doesn't sound like a fun relationship.
All three ended up in England during World War II. Where Radclyffe Hall's health began to decline. There was an operation on her left eye for a cataract in 1941. At one point, it seems as if her immune system collapsed because she had double pneumonia, hemorrhoids, abscesses on her gums, and had to have several teeth removed. Then she went into a coma for several weeks before waking up. It was another 6 months after that before she could actually get up. She then ended up with cancer and was nearly blind. And after all of that, Radclyffe Hall slipped into a coma once again in 1943 and died at the age of 63. So what does one say when the subject is the writer of the most famous Sapphic novel in existence?
I mean, congrats to her for doing it, but what a mixed legacy.
Yes, she brought Sapphism into the public eye, giving many a sympathetic perspective they had not seen before. In standing her ground legally, she made groundbreaking progress in struggling against obscenity laws, even though she lost the one in the UK. Yet her relationships with other creatives of her time, throwing Tupi Lowther for one under the bus, her serial infidelity for another, leave a bitter taste in the mouths of many, and her writing, as much as it wanted to be more modern and not censoring itself, doesn't always come across as good writing. And I don't just mean for the time thinking Virginia Woolf, not liking it. There's also people like me calling it a woe is me pity party. But we can recognize the complicated nature of everything she did and her life, for lack of a better way to say it.
Yeah. Yeah, she helped the cause overall, I feel like. And I don't know, seemed to try her best and really didn't have a great example of happy family life growing up. So maybe we can let her off the hook a bit. I don't know.
But that's our episode. Thanks for joining us as we delved into one of the more well-known figures of the Paris Lesbos crowd of women. Follow us for more tales of their exploits, their tragedies, their very odd antics. And be sure to leave a comment on YouTube with your thoughts and any tips you have on historical women we should explore next. And remember, you too can get involved with an older woman who gets you off the horse and into a historic obscenity trial.